Secretary General Boutros-Ghali, Secretary Baker, ladies and gentlemen, we are indeed very happy to welcome you to this special event under the aegis of the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. We are particularly pleased to have with us tonight His Excellency Mr. Goma, the Consul General of Egypt and the Dean of the Consular Corps, Richard Winerdy, the President of the Texas Medical Center, David Lowe, the President of the UT Houston Health Science Center, and Mrs. Lowe, Joseph McFadden, the President of the University of St. Thomas, and Mrs. McFadden. Now, some of you may mistakenly get the impression we're running a presidential campaign tonight. I don't want any domestic implications into this. I want to welcome Consulwoman Martha Wong, the Honorable Wayne Owens, the former congressman from Utah, and Danny Abraham, a very good friend, entrepreneur, and advocate of Middle East peace through his center, and especially grateful because his wings enabled Mr. Baker to get here tonight to introduce our distinguished guest, the Secretary General of the United Nations. I want to also welcome the distinguished members of Rice University's Board of Governors who are with us tonight, the members of the university administration, the distinguished deans, faculty, alumni, and most importantly, the students. Tonight, with our distinguished speaker, we inaugurate the Shell Lecture Series, which is sponsored by the Shell Oil Company Foundation's generous gift to the Baker Institute. And I'm happy that Jack Doherty, the Senior Vice President of Shell Oil Company Foundation, is with us tonight to launch this series. The presence of His Excellency Boutros Boutros-Ghali complements in a very special way an excellent series of lectures that were given here on Rice University's campus by the Continuing Studies program on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, which we celebrate this year, and Mary McIntyre is at the table, is responsible for that program. Your presence, Mr. Secretary General, also complements the vision of the Baker Institute as a forum of bridging the world of ideas and actions on the key domestic and foreign policy issues which our nation and the world faces. It is now my distinct privilege to welcome the man who has delivered me from obscurity more times than I shall ever mention, to welcome to the podium the Honorable James A. Baker III, the former Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, White House Chief of Staff, and most importantly, Honorary Chairman of the Baker Institute for Public Policy, who will introduce our distinguished speaker, Mr. Baker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Ed Dirigian, for those kind words. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Baker Institute and Rice University, I really would like to welcome you this evening to an event that addresses what I think is one of the most critical and contentious issues facing the international community and the United States today, and that's the question of peacekeeping. Our speaker tonight may well be the world's greatest authority on this subject, but he is a heck of a lot more than that. He is a renowned expert in international law with over 100 publications and numerous awards to his credit. He is a tested diplomat of the first order, having served as Minister of State and then Deputy Prime Minister for Foreign Affairs of Egypt from 1977 to 1991. During those years, he was a key player in negotiating and then in implementing the Camp David peace accords between Egypt and Israel. He has been, since January the 1st, 1992, of course, Secretary General of the United Nations. Our speaker assumed leadership of the United Nations at probably the most critical juncture in the organization's history since its founding in 1945. With the end of the Cold War, the United Nations enjoys opportunities, I think, for cooperation unimaginable during the long years of East-West competition and confrontation when you could almost automatically count on either a United States or a Soviet veto. The Secretary General has underscored the important role that the United Nations plays on such key issues as economic and social development, the environment, and disarmament. But the United Nations, as we know today, also faces a world in which disorder, particularly as we've seen just today in Bosnia, disorder, deadly and often destabilizing, has become an increasingly salient feature of the international landscape. That tragic conflict in Bosnia, the humanitarian nightmare of Somalia, the unspeakable genocide in Rwanda, these are just a few of the challenges that the United Nations and our Speaker has confronted over the last few years. Our Speaker has not shied away from controversy as Secretary General of the United Nations, believing, I think very appropriately and rightly, that an important part of his role is to help frame the international debate. And he is, by the often excessively indirect standards of diplomatic language, refreshingly straightforward. So, my friends, it's a real pleasure and honor for me to introduce an old friend, not only an old friend, but a trusted diplomatic colleague from my days as Secretary of State, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Dr. Boutros Boutros-Ghali. Welcome, Boutros.
Secretary Baker, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me. I am honored to be here and to visit this wonderful new Institute for Public Policy. And I am delighted to have this opportunity to exchange views once again with my friend Jim Baker. Policy making is a rapidly changing world is difficult. The needs are great for development, for democracy, for economic and social progress. As difficult as these challenges are, they are made even more complicated by another major problem of our time, the challenge of peacekeeping. Until the new problems of peacekeeping can be solved, policy makers must focus on the crisis of the moment. Longer-term problems will not receive the attention they deserve. Constructive action on political, economic, and social issues will be delayed. For this reason, I want to share with you some thoughts on peacekeeping today. The United Nations is at the forefront of effort to solve the new range of global security problems. Over the past few years, there have been some setbacks. There have also been successes. Further successes will require support for the United Nations on the part of its member states. Without cooperative multilateral action, the future will not be bright. Almost 40 years ago, the United Nations invented peacekeeping. As the world has changed, so has UN peacekeeping. Peacekeeping has changed on three levels: quantitative, qualitative, and conceptual. In 1988, as the Cold War was coming to an end, the Security Council met 55 times and adopted 20 resolutions. Last year, in 1994, the Council met 165 times and adopted 77 resolutions. In 1988, there were 5 peacekeeping operations with some 9,000 troops deployed. Today, 61,000 peacekeepers are serving in 16 UN peacekeeping operations around the world. In 1988, the budget for peacekeeping was $230 million. In 1994, it was $3.6 billion, nearly 16 times larger than the budget of just 6 years ago. The level of activity, the demand for operations, the number of personnel, the budget involved, all have increased dramatically. In the past, peacekeeping was a clear and simple concept, a neutral and lightly armed forces of interposition between the two state parties to the confrontation. Both parties welcomed the force. The task was to monitor an agreed ceasefire already in place. The mission was to help keep peace so that the parties could pursue a negotiated settlement. This is the case in the Golan today, in Cyprus. Today, most conflicts occur within states, not between them. They are fought not only by armies, but also by irregular groups of militias who defy all authority but their own. Civilians, especially women and children, are the main victims. Vast numbers of refugees and displaced persons need urgent help. In troubled places around the world, member states look to the United Nations to deal with this new form of confrontation. The United Nations is responding. It is adapting its peacekeeping instrument. It is transforming its capacity. In recent UN operation, peacekeepers have been sent to areas where there is no agreement, where they lack the consent of or cooperation of the parties, and where government has limited authority or may not even exist. In such difficult situations, peacekeepers try to keep apart the warring parties. They try to safeguard humanitarian assistance, to protect refugees, to demobilize troops, to clear mines, to promote reconciliation, and to organize free and fair elections. In some places, the United Nations has been called to restore collapsed state institutions and even manage entire ministries of governments. These quantitative and qualitative changes have required conceptual rethinking of UN peace operations. Achieving peace is no longer a strictly political military matter. We are learning that peace requires comprehensive effort. Civilian experts are as important and in some places as numerous as military personnel. Social, humanitarian, and economic mechanisms are crucial. Achieving coordination in peacekeeping now requires far more than integrated troop operations. Civil, humanitarian, and political efforts must be coordinated under the protection of a unified military command. And as peacekeeping operation comes to an end, coordination requires a safe and effective transfer of responsibilities to the next stage of effort. The concept of time has also changed. To stop confrontation before they start, preventive diplomacy must be timely. Measures must often be taken before every details of a crisis can be known. Delay can result in far more costly and difficult problems. Over the long term, complex situations requires comprehensive effort, will take time and commitment in order to succeed. The burden of peacekeeping has become heavy and complicated. Everyone should share in the work. What is needed is a division of labor. The United Nations offers a global framework for such a division of labor. Already, the United Nations is opening its peace operation to new forms of cooperation with governments, regional organizations, and NGOs. It is to Americans alone to decide the role of the United States in peacekeeping. But it does not overstep the bounds for me to say that the United States is immensely important to the United Nations, and to also say that the United Nations is immensely important to the United States. America's non-participation in the League of Nations doomed the Geneva-based World Organization to failure. America's decision to create and support a United Nations is the reason we have a New York-based World Organization today. In peace and security, the United States and the United Nations share the same goal, a peaceful and stable international order. In some cases, the United States will act alone to serve its national interests. Most of today's conflicts, however, are below the limit at which a great power is motivated to act alone. But many such conflicts are above the line where international action of some kind is required. For if not dealt with, they can lead to wider disorder. Working with and through the United Nations, the United States can address such conflicts at an early stage. The US may or may not choose to participate with troops. Acting alone, the United States bears all the costs. Acting with the UN, the cost of America can be 1/3 or less of the total. A division of labor with the UN permits burden sharing and the use of comparative advantage. Such is the case in Haiti, where both the US and the UN are helping to restore democracy. Since the United Nations took over from the US last March, the US cost has dropped from $50 million a month to less than $8 million a month. Or the US may decide that a multilateral coalition of nations can best serve its interests. This was the case in the Persian Gulf War in 1991. In such cases, acting under the UN Security Council resolutions brings international legitimacy and support for the operation. And through post-conflict peace building, as in El Salvador, the UN can consolidate the diplomatic and political achievements of the past. Thus, for peace and security, the United Nations offers the United States more options. Working through the United Nations can mean early and more effective action at lower costs and lower risk. Working with the United Nations can increase effectiveness and lessen the burden. At the same time, it can bring to national policy objectives the many political, financial, and practical benefits of international cooperation. The same is true for development, another shared objective of the United States and the United Nations. The US gives bilateral aid to many countries, but working through the UN, the US can achieve more for its aid dollars. The UN has a unique experience and expertise across the spectrum of development issues. The UN has an unmatched global network of regional commission and country offices, and only the UN has the framework and the legitimacy to shape local, regional, national, and international activities in a common effort. Last year, bilateral assistance from all countries amounted to some $62 billion. With less than a quarter of that amount, with some $13 billion, the UN and its programs and funds undertook a full range of development efforts all over the world. Finally, there is democracy. The United States has long thought to promote democracy overseas as an end in itself, as a contribution to peace and security, and as a way to fight communism during the Cold War. With the end of the Cold War, the United Nations is being asked to promote democracy as well. In many ways, the United States can do more for democracy by working through the UN than it can do on its own. Strengthening political processes and supporting democratic institutions may be seen as an intervention if carried out bilaterally. Today, scores of member states want UN help in democratization. UN experts are regarded as impartial and cost-effective. They can help a country to create a culture of democracy without being criticized for permitting foreign intervention. This is why the UN today is in the forefront of promoting democracy around the world. In the Cold War, the United States spent billions of dollars in the service of stability, development, and democracy. Today, the United Nations can be employed in this work at the cost to the US of between only 1/3 to 1/4 of the UN budget. That is close to 2% of what the United States has to spend each year in the Cold War. The cost of the UN to individual Americans is about $7 per person per year. Because the Cold War has ended, the United Nations is now able to act on behalf of peace, development, and democracy. Because the Cold War was ended, the United States alone no longer can be expected to support these objectives. So a partnership makes sense. We can create that partnership together. It is clear that no single state, even a superpower, can handle all the situations in the world that threaten international peace and security today. My message to you tonight is that through the United Nations, there is a way forward. A new understanding of international peace and security is emerging. Between international war and small-scale confrontations are conflicts and disasters that must be addressed. A member state may conclude that its national interests are not directly affected, but it should also assess what kind of world environment will be created if some crises are left unsolved. Between assistance to the poorest countries and advanced economic progress lie the struggle for development. Old approaches have not done enough. Development today is understood to have many dimensions. The best way to achieve it is through cooperation, is through multilateral effort. And between anarchy and democracy lies the process of democratization. Democratic governments are the best assurance that nations will live in peace. The US has led the way in promoting democracy. The UN can promote democratization in places where no single outside country can succeed. Support for UN efforts now will pay big dividends for democracy later. Financial resources need to be seen in the same way. Costs saved now can allow a crisis to grow until far greater cost must be borne later. If the United Nations is funded only to act on low-cost problems, the worst problems of all can grow out of control. Multilateral action today is cheaper than unilateral action tomorrow. Good management is of the greatest importance. Progress has been made. I have streamlined and restructured the United Nations peacekeeping departments, have totally supported the new independent Inspector General, have established a new task on efficiency headed by Under-Secretary General, which will focus first on peacekeeping costs. These steps are part of a wider drive for efficiency, have set guidelines on responsibility, authority, and accountability. I have ordered a reduction in the Secretariat budget for the next 2-year periods, and since taking office, have reduced United Nations staff by 10%. For the first time in the United Nations history, the management of the organization is being seriously addressed. As the UN becomes more effective, it will be tragic if the UN is not used effectively by its member states. After every world conflict in modern history, a new system of international cooperation had to be built. After the war against Napoleon, after the First World War, after the victory of 1945, which we celebrated this month, in every case, a new structure for stability was constructed. Today, after the global context of the Cold War, this task has fallen to us. The United Nations, so much a dream and a creation of the United States, is ready for use in a great common cause, the cause of peace, development, and democracy everywhere. Let us not turn away from that great cause. Thank you. Now let us move to the question.
The Secretary General has very kindly agreed to answer questions. We have members of our staff who, if you will submit some written questions to them, we already have a few here. We don't want to abuse too much of your time because we know you've had a very long day with your speech before the IIE today and your other activities. Two questions that we've received is, Mr. Secretary General, what is your view on the NATO airstrikes in Bosnia today? Do you approve, and what do you think are their implications?
Certainly I approved the airstrike, as I've approved my special representative when he decided to postpone the airstrike. Secondly, the airstrike proved the importance of the cooperation between the United Nations and a regional organization, the NATO. Thirdly, what will be the consequences of the airstrike? I don't know. Will this help us to promote a new set of negotiation, or will this, on the contrary, provoke an escalation of the different protagonists of the dispute on the ground? It is very difficult to give an answer to this question, but what is important that we have reached a point where the Security Council must decide what exactly we want to do in former Yugoslavia. And I believe that certain difficult decisions have to be adopted so that we can continue to maintain our presence on the ground and in the same time continue to negotiate with the different parties to find a peaceful solution to this very difficult problem.
A complementary question. Can you comment on the retaliation by the Bosnian Serbs to the NATO airstrikes?
I have no comment for the time being because I don't know what is the extent of the retaliation and what will be the reaction of the people on the ground. As you know, I have given mandate to my special representative, Mr. Akashi. Himself consults the military people on the ground. We never take a decision before there is a consensus between all the people involved in the negotiation. Because taking a decision, we must take in consideration three elements. One, the military dimension of the problem, how to protect our blue helmet on the ground. Secondly, a second dimension, the impacts on this enforcement on the negotiation going on. And third dimension, the humanitarian assistance which we are offering to the population. We must not underestimate that we are offering an assistance to 2 million refugee and displaced persons, and we are able to offer this assistance because of the presence of the United Nations forces on the ground.
What options, Mr. Secretary General, do you advocate to render the UN troops in Bosnia and Croatia more effective?
This is the report I have to present in the next few days to the Security Council. We are still discussing with my collaborators and my staff what are the different options. But to be quite simple, we must not underestimate the pressure we received for the contributing countries who want to pull out of former Yugoslavia. So if our aim is to maintain the troops on the ground, we must take in consideration the pressure coming from certain member states who contribute in peacekeeping operation. The Prime Minister of France, the former Prime Minister of France, said that he don't intend to maintain the troops. It was last winter in Sarajevo. The new Prime Minister of France mentioned that if at midsummer there will be no progress, he will pull out the French troops. I received the same message from Canada, from Spain, from Russia, from Great Britain. So here we have to take in consideration the point of view of the countries who are contributing in the peacekeeping operation. We have also to take in consideration what will be the result of an escalation. Are the member states ready to practically to accept a war, to find a solution, to do what I will call peace enforcement and not peacekeeping? What we are doing is a peacekeeping operation. In other words, here we are confronted by a very simple problem. The protagonists of the conflict don't want to solve this dispute peacefully. We cannot impose peace. Our role is to help peace, is to help the negotiation, is to facilitate the negotiation. And once a ceasefire was concluded, to keep peace. to help to maintain the peace, or what happened that we have been able to sign the ceasefire the 1st of January of this year, and the ceasefire finished the 1st of May. And now we are confronted by the absence of ceasefire. We have not been successful to obtain a new modus vivendi, a new ceasefire between the Bosnian and the Bosnian Serb and the governments of Sarajevo. So here we are confronted by many different problems, and if we want to reinforce our presence, this means peace enforcement and not peacekeeping. And until now, the member states have never accepted to move from a peacekeeping operation to a peace enforcement operation.
How important is it to intervene in the internal struggles within countries? Should we just let them fight it out? And a corollary question, do you see the UN involved in any of the internal strife within the former Soviet Union?
We have never intervened without the agreement of the two parties. We have intervened in Salvador in the Chapultepec Agreement signed the 15th of January 1992 because the two parties have asked our presence there. We have intervened in Cambodia after the Paris Agreement had been signed with the agreement of the two parties. We have intervened in Mozambique with the agreement of the governments and the agreement of Renamo. The same now in Angola. Our intervention is based on a protocol signed in Lusaka, where both UNITA and the government of Dos Santos in Luanda have asked our intervention. So we cannot intervene in the internal affairs of a member state unless they agree. You have one exception, which is peace enforcement, that the Security Council decided to use force to intervene. But in all the other cases, we have to obtain the permission of the protagonist of the dispute, to have to obtain their consent. Otherwise, we will not be able to intervene. So, to return to your question, if Moscow will ask tomorrow our role to the United Nations, we will be able to play the role of an honest broker, or we'll be able to intervene. But if they don't ask our intervention, we are not able to intervene.
Secretary General, if the UN is to act quickly to prevent the outbreak of conflict, wouldn't this require both a permanent UN military force and a delegation of a great deal of authority to the Secretary General?
No, I believe that what I've proposed in Agenda for Peace is that each member state will earmark in its national army a contingent which will be trained to peacekeeping operation and will agree to put at the disposal of the Security Council in few days the rapid deployment forces. In other words, we will do exactly what we are doing now, with one difference. A peacekeeping operation takes between 2 to 3 months until we obtain the agreement of the member state, until we find the general, until we find the necessary equipment, until we find the logistic to do the transfer of the troops somewhere in Mogadishu or somewhere in Rwanda or in Burundi. It takes between 2 to 3 months. If the member state accept our approach, which is to earmark in advance and to accept in advance to put at the disposal of the United Nations troops, we will be able to do the same operation, let us say, in 1 week. And this is a huge difference. I have just concluded 3 months ago an agreement with the government of Italy, who put at our disposal in Brindisi a military basis where we are storing our equipment, which is already a first step. So we have a stock of equipment in the case that we will be asked to intervene somewhere in Africa or in Latin America. We have already the equipment. This may facilitate our operation. But the main problem is a purely financial problem. The member states don't pay their contribution. As I mentioned, the budget jumped from $280 million to $3.6 billion. And the member states don't pay their contribution, thus we are not able to operate. What happened practically, that you are borrowing money from the contributing countries. So small countries which send contingent, we owe them to 30 or 40 or 50 million dollars. Last 2 weeks ago, when I arrived in Fiji, and I pay a visit to Fiji because Fiji have participated in 7 peacekeeping operations, I discovered that we owe to Fiji $4 billion, $4 million, and I was put in a very difficult position because all the newspapers coming say maybe he'll coming to pay his debt. And honestly, I was ashamed that a poor country like Fiji, we owe to Fiji, at a certain time we are owing to Fiji $40 million. So what happened is that you are not able to pay the member state, the good boys who are contributing in peacekeeping operations.
2 last questions. You have traveled to Georgia. Could you comment on the refugee situation of 250,000 people? Will the granting of military bases to Russia help resolve this problem?
I was in Georgia. I've seen last week the president of Georgia, Mr. Shevardnadze. I've seen him at least 6 or 7 times. It was not easy to obtain the support of the Security Council in Georgia. And if you want my humble point of view, I believe that as long as those members, as the former member of the Soviet Union, are member of the United Nations, we must serve them exactly like all the member states. And we must pay attention to their problems. And our presence is demanded by Georgia, by Armenia, by Azerbaijan. All those countries are asking the presence of the United Nations. Presence, technical presence, observer, etc. In Georgia, we have been able to obtain a cooperation between what we call the Commonwealth of Independent States and a group of United Nations observers. This is not the first operation of this kind. We have done exactly the same operation in Liberia, where we have United Nations observer and a coalition of African countries called ECOMOG. We are doing the same operation in a certain way in Haiti at a certain period during the presence of the multinational forces under the command of the United States. So I believe that our presence in Georgia is important. Now let us return to the problem. The problem is that negotiations are going on. We have a special representative, which is Ambassador Brunner, a Swiss, who is negotiating with the Abkhaz on one side and the government of Georgia. Until now, we have not been successful. The refugees have not returned. We have on the spot observer and the troops of the Commonwealth of Independent States, who are in majority Russian troops, and we are cooperating together. And I will say that the presence of United Nations observer with Russian troops is better than Russian troops without United Nations observers. And we are still continue to negotiate to obtain an agreement with the leader of the Abkhaz called Azimba. He's a very interesting person. He is a professor of Hittite language and a scholar, and he asked to be recognized as a state, and then he is accepting a confederation between a state and Georgia, and the Georgian cannot accept this. So we are still negotiating with them. The Russians are helping us to find a solution, but the refugees have not returned. There is a difficult situation in the region called Gali and Abkhazia, where you have no security at all, and we are doing our best to contribute to the solution of this problem.
As you well know, the last question is always the most difficult one. Will you seek a second term as Secretary General?
In all honesty, I still have 16 months to make up my mind. It depends on purely when I was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs in '77. I'm sorry, Secretary James Baker. I discovered that to be a Minister of Foreign Affairs, intelligence is not so important. It is physical resistance. So this is the same for the job of Secretary General. So if after 16 months I will discover that I have the same physical resistance, I will ask for a second mandate. But if after 16 months I will discover that I have not the physical resistance, I am honest enough to say, forget about it, and I have many other things to do.
Thank you very much. We wish you well.